You are one of the great historians of our time, respected, sometimes controversial. You have flourished in some of the best universities in the world, from NYU to London School of Economics to Harvard, and now to Hoover Institution at Stanford. Before we talk about the history of money, war, and power, let us talk about a new university you're part of launching here in Austin, Texas. It is called University of Austin, UATX. What is its mission, its goals, its plan?
I think it's pretty obvious to a lot of people in higher education that there's a problem. And that problem manifests itself in a great many different ways. But I would sum up the problem as being a drastic chilling of the atmosphere that constrains free speech, free exchange, even free thought. And I had never anticipated that this would happen in my lifetime. My academic career began in Oxford in the 1980s when anything went. One sensed that a university was a place where one could risk saying the unsayable and debate the undebatable. So the fact that in a relatively short space of time, a variety of ideas, critical race theory or wokeism, whatever you want to call it, a variety of ideas have come along that seek to limit, and quite drastically limit, what we can talk about, strikes me as deeply unhealthy. And I'm not sure, and I've thought about this for a long time, you can fix it with the existing institutions. I think you need to create a new one. And so after much deliberation, we decided to do it. And I think it's a hugely timely opportunity to do what people used to do in this country, which was to create new institutions. I mean, that used to be the default setting of America. We sort of stopped doing that. I mean, I look back and I thought, why are there no new universities? Or at least if there are, why do they have so little impact? It seems like we have the billionaires, we have the need. Let's do it.
So you still believe in institutions, in the university, in the ideal of the university?
I believe passionately in that ideal. There's a reason they've been around for nearly a millennium. There is a unique thing that happens on a university campus when it's done right. And that is the transfer of knowledge between generations. That is a very sacred activity, and it seems to withstand major changes in technology. So this form that we call the university predates the printing press, survived the printing press, continued to function through the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, to this day. And I think it's because, maybe because of evolutionary psychology, we need to be together in one relatively confined space when we're in our late teens and early 20s for the knowledge transfer between the generations to happen. That's my feeling about this. But in order for it to work well, there need to be very few constraints. There needs to be a sense that one can take intellectual risk. Remember, people in their late teens and early 20s are adults, but they're inexperienced adults. And if I look back on my own time as an undergraduate, saying stupid things was my MO. Mm-hmm. My way to finding good ideas was through a minefield of bad ideas. I feel so sorry for people like me today, people age 18, 19, 20 today who are intellectually very curious, ambitious, but inexperienced, because the minefields today are absolutely lethal. And, one wrong foot and it's cancellation. I said this to Peter Thiel the other day. Imagine being us now. I mean, we were obnoxious undergraduates. There's nothing that Peter did at Stanford that Andrew Sullivan and I were not doing at Oxford, and perhaps we were even worse. But it was so not career-ending to be an absolutely insufferable, obnoxious undergraduate then. Today, if people like us exist today, they must live in a state of constant anxiety that they're going to be outed for some heretical statement that they made 5 years ago on social media. So part of what motivates me is the desire to give the me's of today a shot at free thinking and really, I'd call it aggressive learning where you're really pushed. And I just think that stopped happening on the major campuses, because whether at Harvard, where I used to teach, or at Stanford, where I'm now based, I sense a kind of suffocating atmosphere of self-censorship that means people are afraid to take even minimal risk in class. I mean, just take, for example, a survey that was published earlier this year that revealed, this is of undergraduates in 4-year programs in the US, 85% of self-described liberal students said they would report a professor to the university administration if he or she said something they considered offensive. And something like 75% said they'd do it to a fellow undergraduate. That's the kind of culture that's evolved in our universities. So we need a new university in which none of that is true, in which you can speak your mind, say stupid things, get it completely wrong, and live to tell the tale. There's a lot more going on, I think, because when you start thinking about what's wrong with a modern university, many, many more things suggest themselves. And I think there's an opportunity here to build something that's radically new in some ways and radically traditional in other ways. For example, I have a strong preference for the tutorial system that you see at Oxford and Cambridge, which is small group teaching and highly Socratic in its structure. I think it'd be great to bring that to the United States, where it doesn't really exist. But at the same time, I think we should be doing some very 21st century things, making sure that while people are reading and studying classic works, they're also going to be immersed in the real world of technological innovation, a world that you know very well. And I'd love to get a synthesis of the ancient and classical, which we're gradually letting fade away, with the novel and technological. So we want to produce people who can simultaneously talk intelligently about Adam Smith, or for that matter, Shakespeare or Proust, and have a conversation with you about where AI is going and how long it will be before I can get driven here by a self-driving vehicle, allowing me to have my lunch and prepare rather than focus on the other crazy people on the road. So that's the dream, that we can create something which is, partly classical and partly 21st century. And we look around and we don't see it. If you don't see an institution that you really think should exist, I think you have a moral responsibility to create it.
So you're thinking including something bigger than just liberal education, also including science, engineering, and technology. And I should also comment that, I mostly stay out of politics and out of some of these aspects of liberal education that kind of been the most controversial and difficult within the university. But there is a kind of ripple effect of fear within that space into science and engineering and technology that I think has a nature that's difficult to describe. It doesn't have a controversial nature. It just has a nature of fear, where you're not, you mentioned saying stupid stuff as a young 20-year-old. For example, deep learning, machine learning is really popular in the computer science now as an approach for creating artificial intelligence systems. It is controversial in that space to say that anything against machine learning, saying, sort of exploring ideas that saying this is going to lead to a dead end. Now, that takes some guts to do as a young 20-year-old within a classroom, to think like that, to raise that question in a machine learning course. It sounds ridiculous because it's like, who's going to complain about this? But the fear that starts in a course on history, or on some course that covers society, the fear ripples and affects those students that are asking big out-of-the-box questions about engineering, about computer science. And there's a lot, there's like linear algebra that's not going to change. But then there's like applied linear algebra, which is machine learning. And that's when robots and real systems touch human beings. And that's when you have to ask yourself these difficult questions about humanity, even in the engineering and science and technology courses.
And these are not separate worlds in two senses. I've just taken delivery of my copy of the book that Eric Schmidt and Henry Kissinger have co-authored on artificial intelligence, the central question of which is, what does this mean for us broadly? But they're not separate worlds, in C.P. Snow's sense of, the chasm between science and arts, because on a university campus, everything is contagious, from a novel coronavirus to the behaviors that are occurring in the English department. Those behaviors, if denunciation becomes a norm, undergraduate denounces professor, teaching assistant denounces undergraduate, those behaviors are contagious and will spread inexorably, first to social science and then to natural sciences. And I think that's part of the reason why, when this started to happen, when we started to get the origins of disinvitation and cancel culture, it was not just a few conservative professors in the humanities who had to worry. Everybody had to worry, because eventually it was going to come even to the most apparently hard STEM part of the campus. It's contagious. This is something Nicholas Christakis should look at, because he's very good at looking at the way in which social networks like the ones that exist in a university can spread everything. But I think when we look back and ask, why did wokeism spread so rapidly and rapidly out of humanities into other parts of universities, and why did it spread across the country and indeed beyond the United States to the other English-speaking universities? It's because it's a contagion. And these behaviors are contagious. The president of a university I won't name said to me that he receives every day at least one denunciation, one call for somebody or other to be fired for something that they said. That's the crazy kind of totalitarianism light that now exists in our universities. And of course, the people who want to downplay this say, oh, well, there only have been 100 and something in disinvitations, or, oh, there really aren't that many cases. But the point is that the famous events, the events that get the attention, are responsible for a general chilling that, as you say, spreads to every part of the university and creates a very familiar culture in which people are afraid to say what they think. Self-censorship, look at the Heterodox Academy data on this, grows and grows. So now a majority of students will say, this is clear from the latest Heterodox Academy surveys, we are scared to say what we think in case we get denounced, in case we get cancelled. Well, that's just not the correct atmosphere for a university in a free society. To me, what's really creepy is how many of the behaviors I see on university campuses today are reminiscent of the way that people used to behave in the Soviet Union or in the Soviet bloc or in Mao's China. The sort of totalitarianism light that I think we're contending with here, which manifests itself as denunciations, people informing on superiors, some people using it for career advantage, other people reduced to helpless, desperate apology to try to exonerate themselves, people disappearing, metaphorically, if not literally. All of this is so reminiscent of the totalitarian regimes that I studied earlier in my career that it makes me feel sick. And what makes me really feel sick is that the people doing this stuff, the people who write the letters of denunciation, are apparently unaware that they're behaving exactly like people in Stalin's Soviet Union. They don't know that. So they clearly have, there's been a massive educational failure. If somebody can write an anonymous or non-anonymous letter of denunciation and not feel shame, I mean, you should feel morally completely contaminated as you're doing that. But people haven't been taught the realities of totalitarianism. For all these reasons, I think you need to try at least to create a new institution where those pathologies will be structurally excluded.
So maybe a difficult question, maybe you'll push back on this, but you're widely seen politically as a conservative. Hoover Institution is politically conservative. What is the role of politics at the University of Austin? Because some of the ideas, people listening to this, when they hear the ideas you're expressing, they may think there's a lean to these ideas. There's a conservative lean to these ideas. Is there such a lean?
There will certainly be people who say that, because the standard mode of trying to discredit any new initiative is to say, oh, this is a sinister conservative plot. But one of our co-founders, Heather Hying, is definitely not a conservative. She's as committed to the idea of academic freedom as I am, but I think on political issues, we probably agree on almost nothing. And at least I would guess.
Yes.
But politics, Max Weber made this point a long time ago, that politics really should stop at the threshold of the classroom, of the lecture hall. And in my career, I've always tried to make sure that when I'm teaching, it's not clear where I stand politically, though, of course, undergraduates insatiably, curiously want to know. But it shouldn't be clear from what I say, because indoctrination on a political basis is an abuse of the power of the professor, as Weber rightly said. So I think one of the key principles of the University of Austin will be that Weberian principle, that politics is not an appropriate subject for the lecture hall, for the classroom. And we should pursue truth and enshrine liberty of thought. If that's a political issue, then I can't help you. I mean, if you're against freedom of thought, then we don't really have much of a discussion to have. And clearly there are some people who politically seem quite hostile to it. But my sense is that there are plenty of people on the left in academia. I think of that interesting partnership between Cornel West and Robbie George, which has been institutionalized in the Academic Freedom Alliance. It's bipartisan, this issue. It really, really is. After all, 50 years ago, it was the left that was in favor of free speech. The right still has an anti-free speech element to it. Look how quickly they're out to ban critical race theory. Critical race theory won't be banned at the University of Texas. Wokeism won't be banned. Everything will be up for discussion, but the rules of engagement will be clear. Chicago principles, those will be enforced. And if you have to give a lecture on, well, let's just take a recent example, the Dorian Abbott case. If you're giving a lecture on astrophysics, but it turns out that in some different venue, you express skepticism about affirmative action, well, it doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. We want to know what your thoughts are on astrophysics, because that's what you're supposed to be giving a lecture on. That used to be understood. I mean, at the Oxford of the 1980s, there were communists and there were ultra-Tories. At Cambridge, there were people who were so reactionary that they celebrated Franco's birthday, but they were also out-and-out communists down the road at King's College. The understanding was that that kind of intellectual diversity was part and parcel of university life. And frankly, for an undergraduate, it was great fun to cross the road and go from, outright conservatism, ultra-Toryism to communism. One learnt a lot that way. But the issue is, when you're promoting or hiring or tenuring people, their politics is not relevant. It really isn't. And when it started to become relevant, and I remember this coming up at the Harvard History Department late in my time there, I felt deeply, deeply uneasy that we were having conversations that amounted to, well, we can't hire X person despite their obvious academic qualifications because of some political issue. That's not what should happen at a healthy university.
Some practical questions. Will University of Austin be a physical in-person university or a virtual university? What are some, in that aspect, where the classroom is?
It will be a real space institution. There may be an online dimension to it, because there clearly are a lot of things that you can do via the internet. But the core activity of teaching and learning, I think, requires real space. And I've thought about this a long time, debated Sebastian Thrun about this many, many years ago when he was a complete believer in, let's call it the metaversity, to go with the metaverse. I mean, the metaversity was going to happen, wasn't it? But I never really believed in the metaversity. I didn't do MOOCs because I just didn't think you'd, A, be able to retain the attention, B, be able to cope with the scaled grading that was involved. I think there's a reason universities have been around in their form for about a millennium. You kind of need to all be in the same place. So I think answer to that question, definitely a campus in the Austin area. That's where we'll start. And if we can allow some of our content to be available online, great, we'll certainly do that.
Another question is, what kind of courses and programming will it offer? Is that something you can speak to? What's your vision here?
We think that we need to begin more like a startup than like a full service university from day one. So our vision is that we start with a summer school, which will offer provocatively the forbidden courses. We want, I think, to begin by giving a platform to the professors who've been most subject to cancel culture, and also to give an opportunity to students who want to hear them to come. So we'll start with a summer school that will be somewhat in the tradition of those institutions in the interwar period that were havens for refugees. So we are dealing here with the internal refugees of the woke era. We'll start there. It'll be an opportunity to test out some content, see what students will come and spend time in Austin to hear. So that's part A. That's the sort of, if you like, the launch product. And then we go straight to a master's program. I don't think you can go to undergraduate education right away, because the established brands in undergraduate education are offering something it's impossible to compete with initially, because they have the brand Harvard, Yale, Stanford, and they offer also this peer network, which is part of the reason people want so badly to go to those places. It's not really the professors, it's the classmates. So we don't want to compete there initially. Where there is, I think, room for new entrants is in a master's program. And the first one will be in entrepreneurship and leadership, because I think there's a huge hunger amongst people who want to get into particularly the technology world to learn about those things. And they know they're not really going to learn about them at business schools. The people who are not going to teach them leadership and entrepreneurship are professors. Mm-hmm. So we want to create something that will be a little like the very successful Schwartzman program in China, which was come and spend a year in China and find out about China. We'll be doing the same, essentially saying, come and spend a year and find out about technology. And there'll be a mix of academic content. We want people to understand some of the first principles of what they're studying. There are first principles of entrepreneurship and leadership, but we also want them to spend time with people like one of our co-founders, Joe Lonsdale, who's been a hugely successful venture capitalist, and learn directly from people like him. So that's the kind of initial offering. I think there are other master's programs that we will look to roll out quite quickly. I have a particular passion for a master's in applied history or politics and applied history. I'm a historian driven crazy by the tendency of academic historians to drift away from what seem to me the important questions, and certainly to drift away from addressing policy relevant questions. So I would love to be involved in a master's in applied history. And we'll build some programs like that before we get to the full liberal arts experience that we envisage for an undergraduate program. And that undergraduate program is an exciting one because I think we can be innovative there too. I would say 2 years would be spent doing some very classical and difficult classical things, bridging those old divides between arts and sciences. But then there would also be in the second half, in the junior and senior years, something somewhat more of an apprenticeship where we'll have centers, including a center for technology, engineering, and mathematics, that will be designed to help people make that transition from the theoretical to the practical. So that's the vision. And I think like any early stage idea, we'll doubtless tweak it as we go along. We'll find things that work and things that don't work. But I have a very clear sense in my own mind of how this should look 5 years from now. And I don't know about you. I mean, I'm unusual as an academic because I quite like starting new institutions, and I've done a bit of it in my career. You got to kind of know what it should look like. Mm-hmm. after the first 4 or 5 years to get out of bed in the morning and put up with all the kind of hassles of doing it, not least the inevitable flack that we're bound to take from the educational establishment.
And I was graciously invited to be an advisor to this University of Austin. And the reason I would love to help in whatever way I can is several. So one, I would love to see Austin, the physical location, flourish intellectually and especially in the space of science and engineering. That's really exciting to me. Another reason is I am still a research scientist at MIT. I still love MIT. And I see this effort that you're launching as a beacon that leads the way to the other elite institutions in the world. I think too many of my colleagues, and especially in robotics, kind of don't see robotics as a humanities problem. But to me, robotics and AI will define much of our world in the next century. And not to consider all the deep psychological, sociological, human problems associated with that. To have real open conversations, to say stupid things, to challenge the ideas of how companies are being run, for example. That is the safe space. It's very difficult to talk about the difficult questions about technology when you're employed by Facebook or Google and so on. The university is the place to have those conversations.
That's right. And we're hugely excited that you want to be one of our advisors. We need a broad and an eclectic group of people. And I'm excited by the way that group has developed. It has some of my favorite intellectuals are there, Steve Pinker, for example. But we're also, making sure that we have people with experience in academic leadership, and so it's a happy coalition of the willing, looking to try to build something new, which, as you say, will be complementary to the existing and established institutions. I think of the academic world as a network. I've moved from some major hubs in the network to others, but I've always felt that we do our best work not in a silo called Oxford, but in a silo that is really a hub connected to Stanford, connected to Harvard, connected to MIT. One of the reasons I moved to the United States was that I sensed that there was more intellectual action in my original field of expertise, financial history, and that was right. It was a good move. I think I'd have stagnated if I'd stayed at Oxford. But at the same time, I haven't lost connection with Oxford. I recently went and gave a lecture there in honor of Sir Roger Scruton, one of the great conservative philosophers. And the burden of my lecture was the idea of the Anglosphere, which appealed a lot to Roger, will go horribly wrong if illiberal ideas that inhibit academic freedom spread all over the Anglosphere, and this network gets infected with these, I think, deeply damaging notions. So, yeah, I think we're creating a new node. I hope it's a node that makes the network overall more resilient. And right now, there's an urgent need for it. I mean, there are people whose academic careers have been terminated. I'll name two who are involved. Peter Bogosian, who was harassed out of Portland State for the reason that he was one of those intrepid figures who carried out the grievance studies hoaxes, exposing the utter charlatanry going on in many supposedly academic journals by getting phony gender studies articles published. It was genius. And of course, so put the noses out of joint of the academic establishment that he began to be subject to disciplinary actions. So Peter is going to be involved. And in a recent shocking British case, the philosopher Kathleen Stock has essentially been run off the campus of Sussex University in England for violating the increasingly complex rules about discussing transgender issues and women's rights. She will be one of our advisors, and I think also one of our founding fellows, actually teaching for us in our first iteration. So I think we're creating a node that's badly needed. Those people, I mean, I remember saying this to the other founders when we first began to talk about this idea, to Barry Weiss and to Pano Canelos, as well as to Heather Heying. We need to do this urgently because there are people whose livelihoods are in fact being destroyed by these extraordinarily illiberal campaigns against them. And so there's no time to hang around and come up with the perfect design. This is an urgently needed lifeboat. And let's start with that, and then we can build something spectacular, taking advantage of the fact that all of these people they now have very real skin in the game. They need to make this a success, and I'm sure they will help us make it a success.
So you mentioned some interesting names like Heather Heying, Barry Weiss, and so on. Steven Pinker, somebody I really admire. He too was under quite a lot of fire. Many reasons I admire him. One, because of his optimism about the future, and two, how little of a damn he seems to give about walking through the fire. There's nobody more zen about walking through the fire than Steven Pinker. But anyway, you mentioned a lot of interesting names. Jonathan Haidt is also interesting there. Who is involved with this venture at this early days?
Well, one of the things that I'm excited about is that we're getting people from inside and outside the academic world. So we've got Arthur Brooks, who for many years ran the American Enterprise Institute very successfully, has a Harvard role now teaching, and so he's somebody who brings, I think, a different perspective. There's obviously a need to get experienced academic leaders involved, which is why I was talking to Larry Summers about whether he would join our board of advisors. The Chicago principals owe a debt to the former president of Chicago, and he's graciously agreed to be in the board of advisors. I could go on; it would become a long and tedious list. But my goal in trying to get this happy band to form has been to signal that it's a bipartisan endeavor. It is not a conservative institution that we're trying to build. It's an institution that's committed to academic freedom and the pursuit of truth that will mean it when it takes Robert Zimmer's Chicago principles and enshrines them in its founding charter, and will make those something other than honored in the breach, which they seem to be at some institutions. So the idea here is to grow this organically. We need, rather like the Academic Freedom Alliance that Robbie George created earlier this year, we need breadth. And we need to show that this is not some kind of institutionalization of the intellectual dark web, though we welcome founding members of that nebulous body. It's really something designed for all of academia to provide a kind of reboot that I think we all agree is needed.
Is there a George Washington type figure? Is there a president elected yet, or who's going to lead this institution?
Pano Canelos, the former president of St. John's, is the president of University of Austin, and so he is our George Washington. I don't know who Alexander Hamilton is. I'll leave you to guess.
It's funny you mentioned IDW, Intellectual Dark Web. Have you talked to your friend Sam Harris about any of this? He is another person I really admire, and I've talked to online and offline quite a bit, for not belonging to any tribe. He stands boldly on his convictions when he knows they're not going to be popular. He basically gets canceled by every group. He doesn't shy away from controversy, and not for the sake of controversy itself. He is one of the best examples to me of a person who thinks freely. I disagree with him on quite a few things, but I deeply admire that he is what it looks like to think freely by himself. It feels to me like he represents a lot of the ideals of this kind of effort.
Yes, he would be a natural fit. Sam, if you're listening, I hope you're in. I think in the course of his recent intellectual quests, he did collide with one of our founders, Heather Hying. So we'll have to model civil disagreement at the University of Austin. It's extremely important that we should all disagree about many things, but do it amicably. One of the things that has been lost sight of, perhaps it's all the fault of Twitter, or maybe it's something more profound, is that it is possible to disagree in a civil way and still be friends. I certainly had friends at Oxford who were far to the left of me politically, and they are still among my best friends. So the University of Austin has to be a place where we can disagree. We can disagree vehemently, but we can then go and have a beer afterwards. That's in my mind a really important part of university life, learning the difference between the political and the personal. So Sam is, I think, a good example, as are you, of a certain kind of intellectual hero who has been willing to go into the cyber sphere, the metaverse, and carve out an intellectual space, the podcast, and debate everything fearlessly. His essay, it was really an essay on Black Lives Matter and the question of police racism, was a masterpiece of 2020. And so he, I think, is a model of what we believe in. But we can't save the world with podcasts, good though yours is, because there's a kind of solo element to this form of public intellectual activity. It's also there in Substack, where all our best writers now seem to be, including our founder, Barry Weiss. The danger with this approach is ultimately your subscribers are the people who already agree with you, and we are all therefore in danger of preaching to the choir. I think what makes an institution like University of Austin so attractive is that we get everybody together at least part of the year, and we do that informal interaction at lunch, at dinner, that allows, in my experience, the best ideas to form. Intellectual activity isn't really a solo voyage. Historians often make it seem that way, but I've realized over time that I do my best work in a collaborative way, and scientists have been better at this than people in the humanities. But what really matters, what's magical about a good university, is that interdisciplinary, serendipitous conversation that happens on campus. Tom Sargent, the great Nobel Prize-winning economist, and I used to have these kind of random conversations in elevators at NYU or in corridors at Stanford. And sometimes they'd be quite short conversations, but in that short serendipitous exchange, I would have more intellectual stimulus than in many a seminar lasting an hour and a half. So I think we want to get the Sam Harrises and Lex Fridmans out of their darkened rooms and give them a chance to interact in a much less structured way than we've got used to. Again, it's that sense that sometimes you need some freewheeling, unstructured debate to get the really good ideas. I mean, to talk anecdotally for a moment, I look back on my Oxford undergraduate experience, and I wrote a lot of essays and attended a lot of classes, but intellectually the most important thing I did was to write an essay on the Viennese satirist Karl Kraus for an undergraduate discussion group called the Canning Club. And I probably put more work into that paper than I put into anything else, except maybe my final examinations, even although there was only really one senior member present, the historian Jeremy Cato. I was really just trying to impress my contemporaries. And that's the kind of thing we want. The great intellectual leaps forward occurred often in somewhat unstructured settings. I'm from Scotland, you can tell from my accent a little at least. The Enlightenment happened in late 18th century Scotland in a very interesting interplay between the universities, which were very important, Glasgow, Edinburgh, St Andrews, and the coffee houses and pubs of the Scottish cities, where a lot of unstructured discussion, often fueled by copious amounts of wine, took place. That's what I've missed over the last few years. Let's just think about how hard academic social life has become. That we've reached the point that Amy Chua becomes the object of a full-blown investigation and media storm for inviting two Yale Law School students over to her house to talk. I mean, when I was at Oxford, it was regarded as a tremendous honor to be asked to go to one of our tutors' homes. The social life of Oxford and Cambridge is one of their great strengths. There's a sort of requirement to sip unpleasant sherry with the dons. And we've kind of killed all that. We've killed all that in the US because nobody dares have a social interaction with an undergraduate or exchange an informal email in case the whole thing ends up on the front page of the local or student newspaper. So that's what we need to kind of restore, the social life of academia.
So there's magic. We didn't really address this sort of explicitly, but there's magic to the interaction between students. There's magic in the interaction between faculty, the people that teach, and there's the magic in the interaction between the students and the faculty. And it's an iterative process that changes everybody involved.
Yeah.
So it's like world experts in a particular discipline are changed as much as the students, as the 20-year-olds with the wild ideas. Each are changed, and that's the magic of it. That applies in liberal education. That applies in the sciences too. That's probably, maybe you can speak to this, why so much scientific innovation has happened in the universities. There's something about the youthful energy of like young minds, graduate students, undergraduate students, that inspire some of the world experts to do some of the best work of their lives.
Yeah. Well, the human brain, we know, is at its most dynamic when people are pretty young. You know this with your background in math. People don't get better at math after the age of 30. And this is important when you think about the intergenerational character of a university. The older people, the professors, have the experience, but they're fading intellectually from much earlier than anybody really wants to admit. And so you get this intellectual shot in the arm from hanging out with people who are circa 20, don't know shit, but the brains are kind of like cooking.
Yeah.
I look back on the career I've had in teaching, which is over 25 years, at where Cambridge, Oxford, NYU, Harvard. And I have extremely strong relationships with students from those institutions because they would show up, whether it was at office hours or in tutorials, and disagree with me. And for me, it's always been about encouraging some act of intellectual rebellion, telling people, I don't want your essay to echo my views. If you can find something wrong with what I wrote, great. Or if you can find something I missed that's new, fantastic. So there is definitely, as you said, a magic in that interaction across the generations. And it's extraordinarily difficult, I think, for an intellectual to make the same progress in a project in isolation compared with the progress that can be made in these very, very special communities. What does a university do? Amongst other things, it creates a somewhat artificial environment of abnormal job security. That's the whole idea of giving people tenure. And then a relatively high turnover, new faces each year, and an institutionalization of thought experiments and actual experiments. And then you get everybody living in the same kind of vicinity so that it can spill over into 3 a.m. conversation. Well, that always seems to me to be a pretty potent combination. Let's ask ourselves a counterfactual question next. Let's imagine that the world wars happen, but there are no universities. I mean, how does the Manhattan Project happen with no academia? To take just one of many examples. In truth, how does Britain even stay in the war without Bletchley Park, without being able to crack the German cipher? The academics are unsung or partly sung heroes of these conflicts. The same is true in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was a terribly evil and repressive system, but it was good at science, and that kept it in the game, not only in World War II, it kept it in the Cold War. So it's clear that universities are incredibly powerful intellectual force multipliers, and our history without them would look very different. Sure, some innovations would have happened without them. That's clear. The Industrial Revolution didn't need universities. In fact, they played a very marginal role in the key technological breakthroughs of the Industrial Revolution in its first phase. But by the Second Industrial Revolution in the late 19th century, German industry would not have leapt ahead of British industry if the universities had not been superior. And it was the fact that the Germans institutionalized scientific research in the way that they did that really produced a powerful advantage. The problem was that, and this is a really interesting point that Friedrich Meinecke makes in Die Deutsche Katastrophe, the German catastrophe, the German intellectuals became technocrats, Homo faber, he says. They knew a great deal about their speciality, but they were alienated from, broadly speaking, humanism. And that is his explanation, or one of his explanations, for why this very scientifically advanced Germany goes down the path of hell, led by Hitler. So when I come back and ask myself, what is it that we want to do with a new university? We want to make sure that we don't fall into that German pit where very high levels of technical and scientific expertise are decoupled from the fundamental foundations of a free society. So liberal arts are there, I think, to stop the scientists making Faustian pacts. And that's why it's really important that people working on AI read Shakespeare.
I think you said that academics are unsung heroes of the 20th century. I think there's kind of a lazy intellectual desire to kind of destroy the academics, that the academics are the source of all problems in the world. And I personally believe that, exactly as you said, we need to recognize that the university is probably where the ideas that will protect us from the catastrophes that are looming ahead of us that's where those ideas are going to come from.
People who work on economics can argue back and forth about John Maynard Keynes. But I think it's pretty clear that he was the most important economist, and certainly the most influential economist of the 20th century. And I think his ideas are looking better today in the wake of the financial crisis than they have at any time since the 1970s. But imagine John Maynard Keynes without Cambridge. You can't.
Yeah.
Because someone like that doesn't actually exist without the incredible hothouse that a place like Cambridge was in Keynes's life. He was a product of a kind of hereditary intellectual elite. It had its vices, but you can't help but admire the sheer power of the mind. I've spent a lot of my career reading Keynes, and I revere that intellect. It's so powerful. But you can't have people like that if you're not prepared to have King's College, Cambridge. And it comes with redundancy. I think that's the point. There are lots and lots of things that are very annoying about academic life that you just have to deal with. They're made fun of in that recent Netflix series, The Chair. And it is easy to make fun of academic life. Tom Sharp's Porterhouse Blue did it. It's an inherently comical subject. Professors at least used to be amusingly eccentric. But we've sort of killed off that side of academia by turning it into an increasingly doctrinaire place where eccentricity is not tolerated. I'll give you an illustration of this. I had a call this morning from a British academic who said, can you give me some advice, because they're trying to decolonize the curriculum. This is coming from the diversity, equity, and inclusion officers. And it seems to me that what they're requiring of us is a fundamental violation of academic freedom, because it is determining ex ante what we should study and teach. That's what's going on. And that's the thing that we really, really have to resist, because that kills the university. That's the moment that it stops being the magical place of intellectual creativity and simply becomes an adjunct of the Ministry of Propaganda.
I've loved the time we've spent talking about this because it's such a hopeful message for the future of the university that I still share with you uh, the love of the ideal of the university. So, very practical question. You mentioned summer. Which summer are we talking about? So, when I know we don't want to put hard dates here, but what year are we thinking about? When is this thing launching? What are your thoughts on this?
We are moving as fast as our resources allow. The goal is to offer the first of the forbidden courses next summer of 2022. And we hope to be able to launch an initial, albeit relatively small scale master's program in the fall of next year. That's as fast as is humanly possible. So yeah, we're really keen to get going. And I think the approach we're taking is somewhat imported from Silicon Valley. Think of this as a startup. Don't think of this as something that has to exist as a full service university on day one. We don't have the resources for that. You need billions and billions of dollars to build a university sort of as a facsimile of an existing university, but that's not what we want to do. I mean, copying and pasting Harvard or Yale or Stanford would be a futile thing to do. They would probably, you very quickly end up with the same pathologies. So we do have to come up with a different design, and one way of doing that is to grow it organically from something quite small.
Elon Musk mentioned in his usual humorous way on Twitter that he wants to launch the Texas Institute of Technology and Science. TITS. Some people thought this was sexist because of the acronym TITS. So first of all, I understand their viewpoint, but I also think there needs to be a place for humor on the internet, even from CEOs. So on this podcast, I've gotten a chance to talk to quite a few CEOs. And what I love to see is authenticity. And humor is often a sign of authenticity. The quirkiness that you mentioned is such a beautiful characteristic of professors and faculty in great universities. Is also beautiful to see as CEOs, especially founding CEOs. So anyway, the deeper point he was making is showing an excitement for the university as a place for big ideas in science, technology, engineering. So to me, if there's some kind of way, if there is a serious thought that he had behind this tweet, not to analyze Elon Musk's Twitter like it's Shakespeare, but if there's a serious thought, I would love to see him supporting the flourishing of Austin as a place for science, technology, for these kinds of intellectual developments that that we're talking about. Like make a place for free inquiry, civil disagreements, coupled with great education and conversations about artificial intelligence, about technology, about engineering. So I'm actually gonna. I hope there's a serious idea behind that tweet, and I'm gonna chat with him about it.
I do too. Most of the biggest storms in teacups of my academic career have been caused by bad jokes that I've made. These days, if you want to make bad jokes, being a billionaire is a great idea. I'm not here to defend Elon's Twitter style or sense of humor. He's not going to be remembered for his tweets, I think. He's going to be remembered for the astonishing companies that he's built and his contributions in a whole range of fields, from SpaceX to Tesla and solar energy. And I very much hope that we can interest Elon in this project. We need not only Elon, but a whole range of his peers, because this takes resources. Universities are not cheap things to run, especially if, as I hope, we can make as much of the tuition covered by scholarships and bursaries. We want to attract the best intellectual talent to this institution. The best intellectual talent is somewhat randomly distributed through society, and some of it is in the bottom quintile of the income distribution, and that makes it hard to get to elite education. So this will take resources. The last generation of super wealthy plutocrats the generation of the Gilded Age of the late 19th century did a pretty good job of founding universities. Now, Chicago wouldn't exist but for the money of that era. And so my message to not only to Elon, but to all of the peers, all of those people who made their billions out of technology over the last couple of decades is, this is your time. I mean, and this is your opportunity to create something new. I can't really understand why the wealthy of our time are content to hand their money. I mean, think of the vast sums Mike Bloomberg recently gave to Johns Hopkins, to his established institutions, when on close inspection, those institutions don't seem to spend the money terribly well. And in fact, one of the mysteries of our time is the lack of due diligence that hard-nosed billionaires seem to do when it comes to philanthropy. So I think there's an opportunity here for this generation of very talented, wealthy people to do what their counterparts did in the late 19th and early 20th century and create some new institutions. And they don't need to put their names on the buildings. They just need to do what the founders of Chicago, University of Chicago did, create something new that will endure.
Yeah, MIT is launching a College of Computing, and Steven Schwartzman has given quite a large sum of money, I think in total $1 billion. And as somebody who loves computing, as somebody who loves MIT, I want some accountability for MIT becoming a better institution. And this is, once again, why I'm excited about University of Austin, because it serves as a beacon. Look, you can create something new, and this is what the great institutions of the future should look like.
And Steve Schwartzman is also an innovator. The idea of creating a college on the Tsinghua campus and creating a kind of Rhodes program for students from the Western world to come study in China was Steve's idea. And I was somewhat involved, did some visiting, professing there. It taught me that you can create something new in that area of graduate education and quite quickly attract really strong applicants. Because the people who finish their 4 years at Harvard or Stanford know that they don't know a lot. And I, having taught a lot of people in that group, know how intellectually dissatisfied they often are at the end of 4 years. Mm-hmm. I mean, they may have beautifully gamed the system to graduate summa or magna cum laude, but they kind of know they'll confess it after a drink or two. They know that they gamed the system and that intellectually it wasn't the fulfilling experience they wanted. And they also know that an MBA from a comparable institution would not be a massive intellectual step forward. So I think what we want to say is, here's something really novel, exciting, that will be intellectually very challenging. I do think the University of Austin has to be difficult.
Yeah.
I'd like it to feel a little bit like surviving Navy SEAL training to come through this program, because it will be intellectually demanding. And that, I think, should be a magnet. So, yes. Yeah, Steve, if you're listening, please join Elon in supporting this. And Peter Thiel, if you're listening, I know how skeptical you are about the idea of creating a new university, because heaven knows, Peter and I have been discussing this idea for years, and he's always said, well, no, we thought about this and it just isn't going to work. But I really think we've got a responsibility to do this.
Well, Steve's been on this podcast before. We've spoken a few times, so I'll send this to him. I hope he does actually get behind it as well. So I'm super excited by the ideas that we've been talking about, that this effort represents, and what ripple effect it has on the rest of society. So thank you. That was time beautifully spent. And I'm really grateful for the fortune of getting a chance to talk to you at this moment in history, because I've been a big fan of your work. And the reason I wanted to talk to you today is about all the excellent books you've written about various aspects of history, through money, war, power, pandemics, all of that. But I'm glad that we got a chance to talk about this, which is not looking at history, it's looking at the future. It's a beautiful little fortuitous moment. I appreciate you talking about it.